In Our Culture, What's Left of It, writer Theodore Dalrymple considers the state of politics, culture, and the literary world. This event from the Harvard Club in New York City is about 45 minutes.
Now, some of you will remember my saying that my first aim when I came to City Journal 11 years ago was to hire Theodore Dalrymple, whom I considered simply the best journalist in the English-speaking world. This task turned out to be less straightforward than I expected. There was, I found, no such person. There was instead, behind the nom de plume, or nom de guerre, I should probably say, of Theodore Dalrymple, a modest and diffident doctor working in a prison and a slum hospital in a once grand but run-down industrial city in the British Midlands. The pen name did away with the need to disguise his patients when writing about them. He'd simply disguise himself. And it also served to disguise the fact that, despite 2 medical jobs, he also turned out as much writing as 2 full-time journalists. Half the output, you say, could go under his real name, Anthony Daniels. What is amazing about this vast output is both its peerless quality and its breathtaking range. Now, nobody can account for talent, or in this case, genius. I won't try. But 2 definable things at least help explain Tony's achievement. First is his rootedness in concrete reality. Working for 15 years as a doctor and psychiatrist in the slums and the prison, he isn't an abstract or theoretical student of the underclass, but as up close and personal a one as you can find. His knowledge is not of statistics, but of individuals in their full humanity, their complexity and contradictoriness, and often enough in vulnerable and extreme circumstances. He knows what they say about themselves and their world and what they believe. He knows what kind of homes they've grown up in and what kind of homes they make for their own children. He knows them in some ways better than they know themselves, and he writes about them better than any social scientist could ever hope to do. Second, Tony is about the best read person I know, and his reading, particularly of the literary greats, has given him a deep sense of how ideas form the social reality we live in, for good or ill. Conservatives, anti-Marxists that we are, understand that ideas have consequences. We like to quote Keynes's quip that most statesmen are in the intellectual thrall of some defunct economist whose obsolete ideas were once all the rage. And we well know how ideas Okay. And we well know how ideas of this kind give rise to institutions, the welfare system, say, or the organization of the school system, that mold our society in the most direct way. But as Tony shows in Our Culture, What's Left of It, do you 3 doctors want to go over and take a look? But we have 3 more. Thank you. But as I was saying, as Tony shows in Our Culture, What's Left of It, ideas mold our world in another, deeper way, too. The ideas that we get from our culture about what's right and wrong, about what makes a meaningful life, about what our duty is or whether we have any, about what our relations to one another should be like. Western ideals about the dignity of the individual or personal responsibility or the golden rule or the work ethic, ideas forged through the experience and reflection of generations, are the foundation of the incomparable freedom and prosperity we enjoy today. But more recent ideas, formed among the elites but quickly diffused among everyone, ideas like the importance of sexual liberation, or that distinctions between higher and lower, better and worse, are mere instruments of oppression, are molding a very different sort of world. And in Britain, as Tony shows, it is a world in which the underclass, with all the human suffering it involves, is growing in the midst of prosperity, and in which the social order that was the work of so many generations is so visibly and violently fraying. We at City Journal are extremely proud that Our Culture, What's Left of It, is the second collection of Tony's City Journal articles and the 13th book that has grown out of City Journal stories. And that's in 5 years. And I'm delighted and grateful to announce as well that our friend and chairman, Dietrich Weissman, has generously established a new Manhattan Institute Fellowship, and that this talk will be the first in an annual series that Tony Daniels will give as the first Dietrich Weissman Fellow. Tony Daniels.
Well, thank you, Myron. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure, as always, to come to the Manhattan Institute. But on this occasion in particular, I should like to take the opportunity of thanking Mr. Weissman most sincerely for having endowed the fellowship which has been awarded to me, and I shall do whatever I can to prove worthy of it. I should also like to thank, of course, Myron Magnet, without whom my little book would not have been written, and without whose fatherly eye and attention to detail, which is not always pleasing or immediately gratifying to an author, it would have been very much the worse. Well, ladies and gentlemen, a collection of essays such as this book, written over several years, must be a little disparate, but there's nevertheless a theme that runs through our culture, what's left of it. And it's this, that ideas are important, that they are ultimately what determines the shape that our lives take, that intellectuals have a deep, if not always a direct, influence upon the society in which they work, because it is they who originate and then spread ideas, that bad ideas have bad social consequences and in the process ruin many individuals' lives, and that it follows from all of this that they, the intellectuals, have a great and indeed unavoidable responsibility to the society in which they live and work. And it's also my contention, which I outline in this book, that many intellectuals, among them some of the most influential ones, have discharged their responsibilities very poorly over the past century, if not the past millennium. And have helped to bring about catastrophes on both a large and a small scale. Well, it was George Orwell who said, "To see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle." He also famously said that we have sunk to a depth in which restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent men. But to state what is obvious or describe what is in front of one's nose is, from the intellectual's point of view, rather infra-dig, the equivalent, I suppose, of talking about the weather. It should, after all, require no special training to do so. The intellectual, therefore, arrogates to himself the rather more elevated task of discovering what is not obvious, what lies underneath the surface or behind the masks. And he becomes the modern equivalent of the Gnostic, with the result that moral values are easily reversed, and what was formerly thought good becomes evil, and vice versa. And this has certainly happened in my own country, Britain, and moreover it has happened as a mass phenomenon, which I think you would, if you visited Britain, would see on the streets every day. Well, in the book, I give examples of intellectuals' attempt, often a very successful attempt, to ignore the obvious and to reveal hidden characteristics and connections, and thereby to attain a new wisdom. And one of the examples I quote is that of Virginia Woolf, her failure to detect a pretty fundamental difference between the atmosphere, moral atmosphere of Britain and Nazi Germany in 1938, despite the fact that she had just visited Nazi Germany with her Jewish husband. At every point in her book, she drew parallels between the two countries, affecting to find no worthwhile difference between the two, and in the process treating her own personal grievances and dissatisfactions with life as of the same moral dimension as the political and racial persecutions in Germany. Well, it so happens, and I mentioned this in my essay, that my mother arrived in Britain from Nazi Germany as a refugee in 1938, and as a comparatively uneducated adolescent, she had no difficulty whatever in distinguishing Britain from Germany. In fact, education of a certain kind can actually impede rather than enhance understanding of the world. And it's not to be thought that all education is good and leads either to enlightenment or realism. And this has been so for a very long time. I'll give you an example. Shakespeare and his son-in-law, John Hall. John Hall was a doctor educated in Cambridge and possibly at Montpellier, and it is sometimes said that Shakespeare derived his knowledge of medical matters from him. There is, of course, a long history of denying that Shakespeare, that is to say, the person born in Stratford in 1564, could really have been Shakespeare, that is to say, the author of the plays, because Shakespeare in the first sense was insufficiently educated to be Shakespeare in the second sense. He, Shakespeare in the second sense,
like Tony Daniels and Theodore Dalrymple.
That's not a claim I would make for myself. Knew so much about law, medicine, philosophy, seamanship, and many other things that he couldn't have been just the boy from Stratford, but really he must have been Francis Bacon, or the Earl of Oxford, or the Earl of Rutland, or even Christopher Marlowe or Ben Jonson. And people who adhere to one of these real authors of Shakespeare contemptuously call those who think that Shakespeare #1 was also Shakespeare #2, they call them Stratfordians. Well, with regard to medicine, especially in the matter of clinical observation, it is very instructive, actually, to compare Shakespeare with Dr. Hall. Let me first quote from the scene in Henry V, where Mistress Quickly describes the death of Falstaff, a description of such power, actually, that many people think that Falstaff actually appears in the play. This is Mistress Quickly. "I made a finer end and went away, and it had been any Christom child, aparted even just between 12 and 1, even at the turning of the tide. For after I saw him fumble with the sheets and play with flowers and smile upon his finger's end, I knew that there was but one way. For his nose was as sharp as a pen, and I babbled of green fields. How now, Sir John, quoth I, what man, be of good cheer? So I cried out, God, 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 3 or 4 times. Now I, to comfort him, bid him I should not think of God. I hoped there was no need to trouble him with any such thoughts yet. So I bade me lay more clothes upon his feet. I put my hand into the bed and felt them, and they were as cold as any stone. Then I felt to his knees, and so upward, and all was as cold as any stone." Well, the accuracy of the observation here, the medical observation, quite apart from the deeply moving humanity of it, is astonishing. And fumbling with the sheets and playing with flowers or whatever else comes to hand, That's how a person in an organic confusional state, such as Falstaff was suffering from, actually behaves, and these are still used as diagnostic signs. Nose as sharp as a pen, which is again exactly right, part of the Hippocratic facies that presages death. And the disjointed speech is also absolutely right. Now, let me... Yeah. No, I'll just repeat a little bit. Nose as sharp as a pen, which is again exactly right, part of the Hippocratic facies that presages death. And the disjointed speech is also absolutely right. Let us now turn to Dr. Hall. It so happens that he, Shakespeare's son-in-law, had a book published posthumously entitled Select Observations on English Bodies of Eminent Persons in Desperate Diseases, that went through 3 editions in the 17th century. And I quote at random, really. I just opened the book and I will give you an impression of John Hall's mind and observation. Mr. Kempson, aged 60, oppressed with melancholy and a fever, with extraordinary heat, very sleepy, so that he had no sense of his sickness, was cured as followeth. Leaves of mallows, beets, violets, mercury, hops, borage, epithymium, pennyroyal, rue, wormwood, chamomile, seeds of anise, rue, caraway, cummin, fennel, nettles, bayberries, polypod, senna, bark of black hellebore, and boil them all in whey till half be wasted. Of this strained, take an ounce. Confect, I don't know what that is, diaphanae, salt. Mix them and make a clister, that's an enema. This brought away 2 stools with a great deal of wind. It was given in the morning and again at night, and after these were applied to the soles of his feet, radishes sliced, besprinkled with vinegar and salt, renewed every 3rd hour. This hindered the recourse of vapours and drew them back, and so he slept far more quietly, without starting and fear. The following was prepared for his ordinary drink: spring water, syrup of lemons, julep of roses, hartshorn burnt and powdered finely, spirit of vitriol. After, the leeches being applied to the anus, there was drawn 1 ounce of blood. 8 ounces of blood. After which was exhibited this: lapis bezoar, tincture of coral, mix them. It was given in posset drink. After this, the urine was very frothy, with a great sediment, and he was much better. The clister, drink, and powder were repeated with desired event. To remove sleepiness, he used to sneeze only with tobacco. And then he was given the restorative of quercetinus, and that was used. But yet his stomach being very ill, I gave him this: emetic infusion, syrup of violets, oxymel of squills. This gave 4 vomits and 9 stools, after which he was well for 5 days, and then relapsing into a shaking ague, a clister being injected, he became well, bidding farewell to physic, and so was cured beyond all expectation and lived many years. Well, I mean, of course, doctors still use the principle that if the treatment is unpleasant enough, people will get better. But I think the difference between the standard of observation in that page and the passage from Henry V is evident. In the whole of Hall's book, in fact, there's not a striking clinical observation. Indeed, close observation of the kind that Shakespeare made, let alone physical examination of a patient, was regarded as beneath the dignity of the physician because he was a learned man who was in possession of a theory that was deemed all-sufficient and all-explanatory, namely the humoral theory of Galen. And when Hall said of the radishes applied to the sole of his patient's feet that they hindered the recourse of vapours, he had actually observed nothing because he didn't need to observe anything. He knew what had happened because his theory had told him that it must happen. Shakespeare was so accurate as a clinical observer, therefore, not in spite of his lack of medical training, but because of it. Combined, of course, with his natural genius. Yeah, I think I should wait. Yes. No clisters.
The patients are crowded.
I think this is a reenactment.
Yeah.
Why don't we go on? And Tony, if you will go back to a, if you just go back to a paragraph.
Yes,
right,
okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, Shakespeare was so accurate a clinical observer, not in spite of his lack of medical training, but because of it, combined, of course, with his natural genius. He had he trained in the school of physic in which his son-in-law had trained, it's likely that his powers of observation would have been decreased rather than increased. He knew the Galenic theory, of course, but and he uses it as a metaphor in many plays, but he was not enthralled to it. Well, it often seems to me that many intellectuals in the Western world have acquired, or perhaps learned is a better word, the kind of blindness brought on by dogmatic theoretical propositions of the Galenical kind. And they approach the world much as Dr. Hall approached his patients, with an unshakable theory that led and leads to absurd and often dangerous prescriptions. The patient's survival is in spite of and not because of the prescriptions of the doctor or the intellectual, and is attributable to his strong constitution. However, any constitution can be undermined if enough clisters, sudorifics, emetics, diuretics, venesections, and purges are given. My book, then, is a protest against the blind disregard of reality caused by theoretical presuppositions that seem to me at least as absurd as Galen's humoral theory. And as to why people adopt theories that are in conflict with the most minimal honest reflection and observation, I'll quote T.S. Eliot, who, while not always right, was in my opinion right about this. Half the harm done in the world is due to people who want to feel important. They don't want to do harm, but the harm does not interest them, or they do not see it, because they are absorbed in the endless struggle to think well of themselves. Well, he might have added the endless struggle to look well in the eyes of their fellow intellectuals and fear of losing caste. And it is against this dereliction of duty that I have written. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
That was wonderful. Under the circumstances, great. We have time for some questions. And do we have Michael Barrera with his microphone? With two microphones at either end of the room. So those of you who want to ask a question, please wait for the microphone so that our television audience can also hear what you're saying. Tony, I'll leave you to just point at random.
Hi, thank you. Have you, by any chance, I hear you're well-read, read Ian McEwan's novel Saturday? And if you have, do you have any comments about the portrait of the doctor that's in this book, and also the hospital conditions, and any theory about why McEwan might have chosen this particular setting?
I haven't actually read the book, so I can't really comment. Perhaps you can describe it to me.
I was curious to know whether it was in a regular, what kind of hospital it was in. He's a neurosurgeon, and he's a very upper middle class existence. And a lot of the medical procedures are described in the book also.
Would have to be Queen Square.
Yes, it would be difficult for me to comment without having read the book.
You're a keen observer not only of what goes on in England, but what goes on in the United States. How would you assess the moral progress of the United States in the new millennium? The impact of the war on the national psychology, the impact of the Bush administration on our sense of self. Are we making progress, or are we moving backward? How does it look to you from across the ocean?
Well, to me it looks as if, certainly by comparison with us, you've made quite a lot of progress, because there's more resistance to the kind of processes that I've seen in England. So that although I suppose in certain areas you have everything that I describe in my book, the main difference between Britain and America is that in America it's a relatively small proportion of the population, and a fairly easily defined part of the population. That suffers from or has the kind of problems that I describe, whereas in Britain it's actually the heart of the population. And there is also a much more obvious spread, as far as I can see, into the upper echelons of society of the kind of behavior that I talk about. So I think America is actually a much stronger and healthier society, and is much better able to defend itself, or much more willing to defend itself against what I'm talking about. So I would be much more optimistic about the United States than I am about Britain.
If I could just follow on that, do you have a sense of why? Because reading what you write, the social pathology makes me so glad I'm here. But the influences of the welfare state are similar. Why have we done better, and crime is dropping here?
Well, the government claims that it's dropping in the United Kingdom as well. The trouble is that our government is so corrupt, we no longer believe any statistics that emanate from it. I think the difference is possibly that the political class in Britain has a sense of guilt, or pretends to have a sense of guilt, and feels that it can't actually criticize those, an implicit criticism of those on a lower scale than themselves. And there's certainly a great deal of populism, cultural populism, amongst the political class. For example, just to give you one small example, when the new government, the then new government came in, the government of Mr. Blair came in, I looked up all the government ministers in Who's Who. And I was interested to see what their interests were. And practically all of them, I think about 8 out of 10, claimed that and it was their only interest, was football. Now, I'm not quite sure whether it was true that their only interest was football, or whether they were just claiming that and I'm not quite sure which would be worse, whether they were telling the truth or whether they were lying. But not a single one claimed any, what one might call, more elevated interest than that. And there's certainly a feeling in Britain that to behave badly is actually politically virtuous. It is, if you take, for example, the public drunkenness that we see, it's politically virtuous because you are showing that you have no inhibition. There's been a kind of gestalt switch so that those virtues which were previously extolled have become vices.
And is that true in the United States as well?
It isn't, well, certainly with regard to drunkenness, it doesn't appear to be true. Certainly one, I don't know about other virtues.
In our country, religion plays a major role in our society. It's very strong. You hear so much about the Christian right and evangelical movement and so forth. How does this fit into your scheme of things? The strong religious fever of a part of the American population, the Christian right, versus, let's say, England?
Well, religion is definitely dead in England, really. Although there's a small revival in the slums, particularly of Pentecostal-type churches, where if you go into them, you will see that people are seeking an answer to their disorder and the misery around them. Often, if you speak to them, they've had someone badly injured in an attack or something like that. So I do think that religion plays a strong part in keeping society together. I find it quite a difficult question for me because I'm not religious. But nevertheless, I think religion does play a very large part in keeping people together, although also I think when I look at a lot of American religion, I wonder what it actually means inside people. I mean, I do wonder what they actually do believe and how much it affects them. But I think certainly I would prefer a more religious society in England, but I don't see how it's going to happen.
Oh, well, let me see it.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with all your work. Have you written on the single-payer system in the medical care and the related calls in this country to make the pharmaceutical industry an arm of the federal government?
No, I haven't. I didn't know that anyone had suggested that the pharmaceutical industry should be an arm of the federal government. I haven't heard that. Yes, I can talk about the NHS, but that would be very boring.
There's been quite a bit in the media of late about class in America and the lack of mobility among classes, among generations. I wonder what your view of it is, and I wonder what your view of the discussion of class is almost purely a function of economics and less so of morality or cultivation or football fanship. And how those things fit together for you, and how you think America is progressing versus Europe.
Well, class is a very difficult subject in England, because what is very striking about England is that it has traditionally been one of the most mobile societies in the world. And yet everyone thinks that it is a very class-ridden society. And what they mistake is a class society for a caste society. And the fact is that, as I said, it's been certainly in Europe the most socially mobile society that there is, and it's only America, I think, is more socially mobile. What there was in Britain, of course, was an attractive an upper class that was attractive to people who were striving, and as soon as they did well, they joined the upper class, or their children joined the upper class. So that if you look at upper class people, very many of them, only a couple of generations ago, came from very humble circumstances. But unfortunately, people's idea is that this very mobile society was actually a caste society, and that you were destined to live in the caste in which you were born. And this was a complete misapprehension of our society. But because that was the apprehension, a certain number of so-called egalitarian measures were put in place, which actually have made social mobility more difficult. So Britain is now a less socially mobile country than it was when it was supposedly class-ridden. For example, the educational system now offers people in the lower classes almost no means of getting out of their rising above their class. I don't know whether that's happened in the United States, but I believe that the United States has become slightly less mobile than it was. And I would imagine that the same kind of egalitarian social engineering is responsible for that.
A follow-up on that. Are you saying that hang on for the mic here. Are you saying that the decisions that were made to open Eton and Harrow and Oxford and Cambridge to people of lower income groups has not had an enhanced effect in terms of mobility?
No, there are now fewer of the lower class in Oxford and Cambridge than there were before they made any attempts to recruit them. Yeah. In Britain, all policies produce the opposite effect to those intended.
That's not true.
Yes, where? Yes.
There are some of us, maybe I'm in a minority, who are not familiar with your work. Your title is very provocative, Our Society and What's Left of It. Is this something where we have some culture, and we are going to be losing it? Is there a call to action, or what happens? I don't see enough about what the book might be about for me to go to read it. Could you kind of sell it a little bit?
Yeah. One of the things that has happened in our society is that people have been disconnected from any of the past culture, I mean the high culture, so that it is deliberately not taught. And this is in my view, has the effect, whether it was deliberate or not, I'm not sure, but it has certainly had the effect of making people live in an eternal present moment, where life is just one thing after another. And in the book, I try to discuss the connection between our loss of cultural identity with the social breakdown that to me is perfectly obvious in Britain, and no doubt in other societies as well.
Just follow on. David Reisman and the lovely crowd, are we getting less inner-directed? Are we getting more outer-directed? Versus, of course, tradition-directed.
Well, I think I think we are increasingly, in Britain anyway, people are solipsists. And you can see this, for example, the number of people living in one-person households has dramatically increased, which is one of the reasons why there's so much pressure on housing, incidentally. That's one thing. I don't expect you've ever done this, but if you go into what are called nightclubs, in my childhood I remember nightclubs were sort of tables with little lamps and people performing on the stage in a slightly louche way. But now they are giant halls where 10,000 people go. The music is so loud that no speech is possible. And if you actually observe people dancing, they're dancing with themselves. and they don't actually socialize in any way at all. They gather, but do not socialize. And so on the one hand, we see a kind of, if you like, massification, and on the other hand, we see an atomization at the same time. And this is very noticeable, certainly in Britain.
The theme of your remarks is the denial of reality by the intellectual class, that they simply don't notice the most apparent facts about the social problem. I think that's true in this country, too. There's a kind of blindness about the face of the problem and the desire to get beyond that to some more sophisticated analysis, a way really not to see the symptoms and to make them unimportant. And right at the end of your talk, you began to address why that is so, where that reflex comes from. And you quoted from T.S. Eliot. I'd like to know where that's from, and if you could enlarge on that theory a little bit.
Well, what I'm saying is that people don't like to follow the train of their thoughts because it can lead to ideas that superficially seem ungenerous. I mean, to hold, for example, criminals responsible for their acts seems ungenerous because it is a fact that most criminals come from unpleasant or difficult backgrounds, and of that there is no question. And so if you say, but nevertheless, whatever background you've come from, you are responsible for what you do, it does seem, at least superficially, to be an ungenerous response. Because most people who say it, most people in this room probably would have come from a relatively privileged background, or at least stable background. So they have not experienced what the criminal. So the criminal turns around and says, well, who are you to judge? You haven't lived through all this. On the other hand, at a deeper level, you are, of course, saying to the person, you are a man like me. There is no real difference between you and me. But as I said, it appears ungenerous. It can easily, and it can actually, at times, it can be ungenerous and unfeeling. So intellectuals prefer not to ascribe responsibility to people who are genuinely disadvantaged or who have been disadvantaged in some way. And if they do so, they lose caste with all the other people who think in that fashion.
The England that I grew up in seemed to be a very homogeneous society in the 60s, and I was at Cambridge in the 70s. I was interested to know what you think the impact of immigration has been on British society in the last 15 years.
I don't think the impact of immigration would have been so serious if we had not gone in for ideas of multiculturalism. If we had said that people come here and once, like it was in America, I don't know whether it still is, once you arrive in America, you become an American. If people had been told when you come here, you become British, as in fact happened to my mother. Nobody ever helped her. Nobody ever said, well, we must all learn German so that your mother doesn't feel not at home. And you mustn't laugh at this because, for example, when I come into the airport of my city, all the notices are for British citizens are up in English, Punjabi, Urdu, and Hindi, which quite clearly gives the message that all that has happened is that you have moved 8,000 miles or whatever number of thousand miles it is. You haven't moved. You don't have to have moved mentally. Had we been less politically correct, I don't believe for a minute that there would have been so many problems. Incidentally, in France, there's a slightly different problem in that the French rigidity of the labor system prevents the integration of large numbers of people of North African origin into French society. And if the labor laws were less rigid, they wouldn't have the problems that they have. At least I don't think so.
Would you comment on the recent...
Theodore Dalrymple is a doctor and columnist for the London Spectator. For more information on our culture, what's left of it, visit the publisher at ivanrd.com.